Under a vault of ribbed oak and flickering gaslight, the silk of her veil caught a wandering spark and curled like a sigh. The organ faltered. Faces turned like pans in a foundry. One motion, one heat. Isabela II stood at the altar in a gown the color of snow that has not yet decided to fall. And when the minister lifted his eyes to invite the groom forward, there was only an empty aisle, fading boothiels, and the smell of coal rolling in from the river. Outside, Pittsburgh's mills exhaled, and the sky answered with cinders like orange snow. A newsboy, hungry for drama, was already rehearsing a headline about a wedding that had sweetened the Sunday pages. By the chapel door, a small man with a scuffed collar and a modest smile straightened a stack of programs, checked his watch with the meekest confidence, and vanished into the crush without making a ripple. They called the groom the Steel Prince, but he was merely Thomas Merrick, heir to the empire of George Merrick III, whom the city nicknamed George III, with the sort of affection men save for tyrants who donate to their favorite charities. In the parlors where lace archived women's patience, he was eloquent about order. In the mills where heat wrote on men's lungs, he was precise about silence. He embraced piety and thrift as if they were sons whom he meant to raise hard. Sometimes, after an oration that convinced even doubters, he would look far away, as if a wind had rattled the panes inside his skull and blown his reason from its hook. Then he would compose himself again, prettier than principle, as if nothing had slipped. He valued the word proper the way engineers value steel, because bridges collapse without it, and the wrong men drown. Isabela II did not faint. She did not bitterly bless the congregation. She lifted her veil with a patient hand and discovered that the line between humiliation and clarity is a gaslight's flicker wide. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, and her voice held steady as a spring under strain, "it seems dinner will be early." Etiquette demanded pity. Appetite offered spectacle. Propriety, which is cruelty's favorite suit, sighed as if it had never seen such a scene. In the sacristy, a junior clerk from the Merrick solicitor's office, Mr. Linwood, brown hair almost invisible against brown wallpaper, bustled to press a glass of water into her hand. "The side door," he murmured, sincere as a hymn. "Quiet, if you like." He left no scent but paper and citrus, and the suggestion that someone, somewhere, was organizing the world on her behalf. Isabela II was 26, and accustomed to arranging her mind like a hat no one could quite see the shape of. Her father crafted glass that made the river look civilized. Under a pen name, she wrote for a ladies' gazette that argued for a woman's right to her wages, to her property, to her vote, arguments as precise as stitches and as disarming as compliments. She had chosen Thomas because she hoped to meet power at eye level and teach it to listen. She had mismeasured. When she returned to her father's stoop that night with her trunk and a reputation that society would now test like ore, she combed out her hair and, following a fashion both tender and bizarre, twisted a small lock into a ring she tucked inside her sleeve to mourn what had not died. Then she read until the gas trembled. Labor reports, corporate ledgers, sermons whose moral thunder hid arithmetic. When sleep climbed her bed at last, it carried a glow of molten metal and a voice that sounded like her own. "This is not over." The city had a way of singing that certain tragedies were instructive. The bishop called what had happened providence and suggested patience. The editor of the Daily Trumpet declared it a delicate affair of the heart, and then printed a cartoon of a bride chasing a locomotive with a bouquet. George III called in person at the glassworks, hat in hand, courtesy folded like a knife. "My son is of a tender nature," he explained, with the mildness of a man about to attach a chain to a beam. There were obligations, mergers, a promise to the Landstrom rails, matters of order. Your disappointment is regrettable. It is also typical. His gloves squeaked as he adjusted them, and in that small piece of theater lay a decade of making men look away while nodding. Typical, Isabela II repeated, as if choosing a glass to throw. She chose none. Instead, she went out the next morning to the mill rows where houses wore soot and women in widows' black boiled potatoes with coins in their pockets to convince Providence it had not seen them yet. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy held a post-mortem photograph of her boy, eyes gentle and forever shut, and told Isabela II how the chain had snapped under a bell of steel. They called it misadventure, she said in an accent that made grief sound older than language. I call it a man's choice not to buy a better chain. Pittsburgh sweet-talked itself with phrases about progress until men bled, and then it said the bleeding was the price of admission. Isabela II began to draw a string through the city from ledger to ledger, knot to knot. She traced the chain to a supplier that supplied sermons to officials and broken links to the mills. At the telegraph office on Market Street, wood stove heat, ink-stained counters, clerks whose elbows had seen more secrets than most priests. She sent inquiries to cousins in Philadelphia who knew banks and to a clubwoman in New York who controlled more gossip than a bishop. Wherever she went, Mr. Linwood appeared in the periphery as if he were a coat rack, at the recorder's office holding the door, at a tea sponsored by the bishop's wife fetching extra lemon, in the Gazette vestibule picking up a forgotten umbrella. He apologized for weather as if he had arranged it. He was forgettable with a scholar's posture. He was helpful like a coincidence. Under a steel sky that shone like a bruise, she followed a foreman named Jonas Pike into the mill. Sparks fell around them like coerced constellations. They stood near a Bessemer converter, as if at the lip of a volcano civilized into obedience. Jonas swore that the inspector's stamp meant nothing. They temper for speed, not strength, he shouted over the roar. He pressed a sheaf from a supplier's ledger into her hand. Pages ripped cleanly, too cleanly. Found it under a stool. Maybe it fell there, he said with a grin that knew better. Maybe someone put it where I could find it. She thought of Mr. Linwood, of how the city's secrets wandered off only after someone carried them halfway. Society forgives men by hiring them and punishes women by inviting them to tea. Isabela II dressed in resignations and showed up in parlors where calla lilies smelled like money. There, with the gentlest of smiles, she asked aldermen how they reconciled the gospel with envelopes that rustled like autumn. She asked clergymen whether charity without accountability was merely laundering. She asked wives if they had ever noticed that men often called the price of their mistakes God's will. Meanwhile, the Daily Trumpet mocked a long-dead monarch's madness on stage while Mr. Linwood, under the stairs, leaned on a mop handle and watched her not laugh. She was mapping a labyrinth and discovering someone had been sweeping its paths clean. She needed leverage from farther away than City Hall. That night, in a telegraph office that felt like a chapel for stubborn prayers, she wrote to London. The address was Windsor, and the recipient was Her Majesty's private secretary. She described chains and deaths and contracts and the arithmetic of negligence that turned boys into numbers. She invoked not pity, but reputation. The British syndicate that underwrote certain American rails included men whose names decorated charities beloved by the Queen, homes for widows, schools for orphans. If American negligence, stamped with their respectability, cost lives, their piety would be mocked. She sent figures precise enough to stand up in Parliament, and by steamer sent the O'Shaughnessy photograph with a braid of the child's hair, a Victorian plea armed in both data and mourning. "Ambitious," said Mr. Linwood, who materialized to comment on the address before she sealed it. "Appealing to a queen. Do you imagine she makes time for transatlantic arithmetic?" "She makes time for her own optics," Isabella II answered, and sealed the envelope with the steadiness of a surgeon. At the bishop's ball, the waltz glimmered and manners fluttered like tiny flags. Grief wore hairwork brooches, twists of the departed set in gold. Women danced in obedience to loss. George III moved through the room like a ship that expected harbors to curtsy. When he reached Isabella II, he smiled with the gentleness of a man about to push. "You were never a match for my family," he said, voice sweet, eyes sharp. "Your pride has no spine." "Your conscience has a fine spine," she replied. "It never bends." He laughed for both of them. 3 nights later, the telegraph clerk's hands shook as he read the palace's cable. The Queen's private secretary, in the politest thunder, announced that the syndicate would suspend financing pending investigation and recommended associated insurers reevaluate liabilities on Merrick Steel. It did not accuse. It did not command. It shifted the lighting, and men saw what they had preferred to ignore. In New York, counting houses murmured. In Pittsburgh, aldermen developed an allergy to the Merrick dinners. The Daily Trumpet learned a new word, safety, and used it as if it had coined it. George III called this foreign interference and offered inspections by men who shared his pew. Even as reputations rebalanced, the city performed a ritual of punishment disguised as procedure. The sheriff's men raided the Women's Benevolent Society and treated arithmetic like contraband. They rifled her desk and found copies of letters stamped demurely with the palace seal. "Conspiring with foreign powers?" the officer announced, savoring his syllables. Isabella II's father intervened and earned a cuff for obstructing an investigation. At the station, a magistrate whose cufflinks had known the Merrick table granted bail and smirked. "What is it that you women want?" he asked the heir. "To be believed," she said, "and then to be feared." She paid from coins collected by widows whose pride cost more than bread. At the steps, Mr. Linwood waited, an umbrella already open, sympathy arranged like a shawl. "If asked," he offered lightly, "I could have misplaced that warrant." The casual confidence made her stomach drop even as rain, impatient, drummed parasols. Thomas appeared with roses that felt dishonest, then with thistles that felt like a confession. "Tell me you didn't mean for everything to break," he begged. "Tell me you didn't intend to crush us." "I intended to count the dead," she said. "Your father's choices brought the rest. He proposed Chicago, anonymity, redemption through geography. You left me before God and everyone," she answered. "If you cannot hold a vow in a church, how will you hold one in hunger?" He left, his face learning how to lose. The courtroom smelled like wool and expectation. Isabella II presented the chain with the detachment of a surgeon and the heart of a mother. Jonas Pike declined to clean his hands. "Dirt tells the truth," he said, and the court laughed until it didn't. The judge, a man who wore his morality like an heirloom watch, denied George III's injunction by the slimmest of legal threads. Public interest, he said, had a claim. Inspectors from 3 cities, none of them beholden to Merrick dinners, would enter the mills, credit tightened. Rumors snapped like wire. The Merrick empire staggered. In response, George III cut wages with the same public gravity with which he cut ribbons at orphanages. Men walked out with lunch pails that felt like small coffins. Women in black shawls stood like sentinels of hunger. Victory, Isabela II realized, comes with invoices. Rain polished the river. Pinkertons appeared like dark punctuation at street corners. There were no pistol shots, no gore, only the arithmetic of threat. A boy threw a stone and missed. A man shoved. Someone fell and stood again, with dignity intact. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy's jaw set like a gear. Isabela II swallowed guilt like medicine and got to work. The letter from London arrived on creamy paper that smelled of a garden she would never see. Her Majesty had considered the matter, and without dispensing orders to a republic, invited collaboration. An American committee to coordinate relief with British charities so that money intended for widows and orphans would not be laundered by negligence. It was mercy executed as politics. The Queen, who needed the moral language of motherhood to season an empire, was protecting her own reputation while incidentally saving lives. Isabela II accepted the language and used the power. They formed the Widows' and Workers' Trust. The city could not mock it without confessing its own piety was theater. Jonas Pike sat on the board with hands unwashed as a policy. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy scolded bankers into decency. Lawyers who had refused to represent a jilted bride now competed to advise a fund whispered to at Windsor. The trust purchased, at auction, a failing Merrick plant. Men returned to the floor with new rules hammered like commandments. Chains stamped with dates and foremen's names. Safety whistles. Inspections at shifts that made supervisors look men in the eyes. They printed pamphlets with drawings so plain even pride could read them. On the first day, a pulley shrieked and held. For that hour, somewhere, nobody died because a woman had refused to be quiet. Meanwhile, the city's polite society performed its own theater. At a memorial tea, black gloves, heavy cake, laughter disguised as etiquette. Isabela II watched a clergyman bless the memory of a donor and then whisper to an alderman about an investigation that could be managed. She moved through conversations as if inching along a ledge, asking who approved inspectors, who sold chains at a discount, who collected envelopes that rustled like leaves. In the corner, the modest man with the scuffed collar offered to carry a plate. Mr. Linwood's face could have been cast in an unremarkable mold and copied for 1,000 clerks. His eyes, however, were as active as clocks. He presented himself as a neighbor. He watched like an owner. Late one evening, the trust's new mill almost died. A supplier delivered a batch of chains stamped correctly but curiously light in the hand. Jonas tested one with a hammer and listened like a musician to a false note. He sent for Isabela II, who arrived with her sleeves rolled and her caution high. Inside the bale's twine, tucked like a moth, lay a page from a ledger they both recognized. The same supplier's book that Jonas had found under his stool weeks earlier. Now it wore a watermark from a solicitor's office 3 blocks from the Telegraph. Linwood and Ash. She knew the font. She had seen it on envelopes carried like secrets. Planting evidence to frame a rival? Jonas asked, then spat a curse that steamed in cold air. Or planting it to frame us, she countered. Tomorrow this false proof would have been found on our floor. She burned the page in a bruxicher, watched ink surrender to fire, and felt power. For the first time, choose subtlety over triumph. You just sacrificed leverage, Jonas said. I saved a life, she answered. One day yours. She confronted Mr. Linwood on a street that smelled of yeast and coal. Which version of your name is true? She asked without greeting. All of them, he said, amused. In the lamplight, his face changed into any face you might trust to deliver a message or hold a door. I did not cause your chains to fail, or your men to cheat their ledgers. I accelerated the world toward the truth it already preferred. You arranged the wedding, she accused, the humiliation finally finding the shape of a question. He considered the sky as if it had asked him for an opinion. I delivered a message on your wedding morning, he admitted casually. A banker's condition to your fiancé. Marry Landstrom's daughter, secure the rail merger, repair your father's covenant. If the wedding proceeded, credit would wither. If it failed publicly, pity would ripen into terms you could swallow. I prefer outcomes that teach you prefer mazes, she said, and the word sounded like a diagnosis. Mazes teach, he answered, as if that saved him. She met George III, not in a courtroom, but in his conservatory, where he spoke to orange trees as if they were obedient courtiers. Bees drowsed in glassy warmth. For a minute, the theater fell away, and a man remained. A farmer trapped inside a king. A man whose sanity sometimes wandered the corridors and came back with pockets full of wind. You have made my city tremble, he said, touching a leaf with reverence. You call it justice. I call it mess. Justice, she replied, is the most expensive order a city can buy. It looks like mess at first because we were so tidy about our lies. He smiled, not without charm, not without tragedy. Would you bend? He asked. If bending saved jobs? I would bend if bending saved lives, she said. You have often chosen the other direction. He offered her a covenant. In exchange for public absolution, he would appoint a safety auditor of proven character, which meant his pastor's cousin. She declined. He dismissed her with a sigh that belonged to emperors and engineers. The inspection reports arrived like winter letters. Cold, conclusive, guilty. Insurance houses recalculated mortality and developed allergies to Merrick signatures. Banks sniffed panic under their ledgers and tightened like fists. In New York, men who wore striped trousers made fear look like arithmetic. Across the ocean, a second letter arrived from Windsor, this time from a lady-in-waiting, inviting the trust to advise on a British relief fund for industrial disasters, with the assurance that American cooperation would be highlighted in the Queen's next statements, applauding charitable vigor. The Queen did not rescue by decree, she rescued by attention. She would not mention Pittsburgh, she would praise a citizen committee of uncommon energy. That was her genius, to make a nation better by flattering it for virtues it had yet to fully practice. The city council convened hearings because it loves a penitent more than a saint. Isabela II sat under gas jets that hummed like judgment and detailed how chains fail, how bribes are disguised as civic responsibility, how words like family and thrift become weapons pointed downward. Women crowded the gallery in black crepe with eyes like embers. A vaudeville performer snuck in to study the room's rhythms so he might mock them later. George III turned his profile to the light as if being a statue would help. Agitators, he murmured afterward to an alderman, especially the female kind, act like rust. The alderman nodded because powerful men prefer metaphors to chains. That evening, the Daily Trumpet printed a cartoon of Isabela II as Lady Justice with a smelter's apron and a scale that held a chain on one side and a widow's braid on the other. The city laughed and then, quietly, learned. At dusk near the river, a train screeched and did not derail because one of the trust's new chains did not fail. 100 families slept through the hour they might have died. No one wrote a poem about it. In the mill the next morning, A foreman tried to pocket an envelope and found himself confronted by Jonas's gaze, which had grown into policy. "We are stamping names now," Jonas said without raising his voice. "Men sign their work in steel, and they do not like reading their names on coffins." The foreman put the envelope down. Across the street, Mr. Linwood applauded once, softly, to the air. The last stand of George III took place not on a factory floor, but on a bank's cold tiles. The London syndicate called in credit with a cable long as a winter noon. New York stopped pretending it believed in miracles. George III convened the press, praised Providence as if it were on retainer, intimated foreign plots, and announced a donation to the orphanage to purchase one paragraph of kindness in a future obituary. He did not say Isabela II's name. He did not say widow. He did not say chain. He said instead, "I have been misrepresented," as if that were a fiscal category. The trust bought a slice of his weakest mill. The rest scattered into auctions where men with tidy nails bought bargains and told their wives it was the market doing God's work. Later, in the quiet half-light of the trust's office, ledgers neatly lined, a teacup cooling on a windowsill, Isabela II opened a small parcel addressed in a clerk's unobtrusive hand. Inside lay a calling card printed with only a street and a room number. On the back, a modest script confessed, "You were not the only one who wrote to the palace." A tiny laugh escaped her, sharp enough to cut paper. She burned the card. She memorized the number. She would not walk that corridor. She would map it. Thomas came without roses. His hands were empty in a way that suggested they might learn. "I loved you badly," he said in the tone of a man who wanted the world to forgive him for being raised wrong. "I am trying to learn hunger for the right things. You were trained to prefer the absence of scandal to the presence of truth," she answered, not unkindly. "Train a boy to that standard, and you will break him when the world asks for courage." "Will you forgive me?" he asked as rain stitched the window. "I will not carry you," she said. "But you may walk beside me when you know where you are going." He nodded, and for the first time, looked like a man who belonged to himself and not to a dynasty. Spring pretended to arrive. On a day that smelled faintly of yeast and iron, the trust unveiled a small footbridge across a canal that had recently swallowed a child's toy and nearly the child. Women carried loaves. Men carried shame like a coin they were learning not to spend. Isabela II stood to the side, letting others cut ribbon. Across the alley, Mr. Linwood lifted his hat in the half-salute of a co-conspirator or a neighbor. "You have not asked me to leave town," he observed. "I am busy," she said dryly, "and banishing one man will not turn a maze into a road." "No," he agreed, eyes bright. "But a city that learns to read its maps will waste less time walking in circles." "You drew the circles," she countered. "I drew opportunities for honesty," he said with such mildness that a passerby might have thought them discussing weather. "I am very bored, Miss Isabela. It delights me to see what happens when bored men are forced to work and bored women discover they were cleverer than instructed." She visited George III one last time, not as supplicant or judge, but as a citizen. He sat alone in the empty counting room of a building that had once made men feel safe. Dust floated like underemployed angels. He stared at his hands as if they were drawings of hands he had been asked to copy, and could not. "You have wounded me," he said without heat, which was worse. "You have cut me to teach me. But did you ever consider how fear makes cowards of men who would otherwise be decent?" "Yes," she replied, "every hour. And I considered how your version of decency required widows to count their coins twice." He lifted his eyes, and for a moment she saw the farmer trapped inside the ironclad, a man who loved order because his mind feared its own storms. "I kept the city from chaos," he said softly. "You kept it from change," she answered. She offered him a document, a formal transfer of certain patents to the trust, in exchange for a public letter recognizing his early philanthropy. It was mercy in the language he understood. Legacy. He signed without surprise. He had begun to learn arithmetic too late. Night draped itself over gaslit streets. Vaudeville houses bloomed with laughter that had the relief of new air. Church bells rang because they had been wound, and trains crossed bridges whose chains held their breath, and then, gratefully, did not fail. Isabela II walked home along a boulevard where carriage wheels whispered over wet cobbles and where, in windows, families practiced little rituals of decency that multiplied 1,000 times, make cities survivable. She set a lamp in her window for anyone lost. She opened her journal not to send to any gazette, but to keep herself honest. She wrote down the names of every woman who had carried a loaf or a ledger, every man who had signed his name to a chain. She wrote a sentence she meant to remember when the next battle demanded patience. Be exact, be disarming, and be ready to pay. The twist found her a week later at a tea hosted by a woman whose gloves cost more than a worker's month. A lady-in-waiting on tour from London, cheeks purposeful with diplomacy, told a story about Her Majesty's interest in the American Committee. The Queen was first alerted by a letter from a gentleman of uncommon modesty, she confided, enjoying the surprise coursing through the room, who wrote not to denounce a man, but to praise a woman for her rigor. The guests sighed as if they loved proofs of moral geometry. Isabela II's teacup trembled an almost imperceptible amount. Mr. Linwood had written to Windsor first. He had staged the stage on which she had performed. She allowed herself one heartbeat of rage and then stored it like coal for winter. The game was larger than one man. It always had been. In a small ceremony more significant than it looked, the trust began stamping a tiny emblem into every chain, a triangle for 3 lives saved from one chain's strength: worker, traveler, child. On a platform inside the mill, Jonas swung a hammer and engraved his name as if admitting he existed. Mrs. O'Shaughnessy collected receipts with the severity of an abbess. Isabela II watched and understood that revenge had delivered justice, and justice had delivered responsibility. She had toppled a magnate. Now she had to build a city that didn't miss him. If you found yourself leaning in, if the gaslit streets made you hear your own heartbeat and the clatter of carriage wheels, then carry this story to someone who still believes order is kinder than justice. Tell them a jilted bride taught a steel town to count lives honestly. And stay with us for the next walk down these wet cobbles, because a familiar figure with scuffed cuffs is already arranging new scenery, and a woman you underestimated has learned to turn mazes into maps.